14 acres. That is what one woman bought for less than the price of a used truck in the spring of 1988. 14 acres of exposed limestone shelf and cracked hardpan on the eastern edge of Sorrow Creek Valley that the county assessor had been listing as unbuildable, unirrigable, and agriculturally worthless for the better part of 2 decades. The man who sold it to her told her she was paying too much. The neighbors who watched her move on to it told each other she was paying with her sanity. For 6 years after that, she rearranged rocks. That was the part everyone in the valley remembered and repeated, because it was the part that made the least sense to watch from the road. A woman moving stones from one part of her land to another in patterns nobody could interpret, planting ground cover that looked like weeds between the arrangements, digging shallow channels with a hand tool that were too small to irrigate anything and too large to be accidental. When the drought of 1994 hit the Sorrow Creek Valley and held for 18 months, taking every active well in the valley below the water line by the summer of 1995, the only functioning water source on any private land in a 40-mile radius was on 14 acres of limestone shelf that a county assessor had called worthless for 20 years. The man who had sold it to her, the same man who sat on the county water board and had spent 6 years filing development restriction complaints about her rock arrangements, was the same man who drove out to her gate in August of 1995 with his hat literally in his hand, asking her to explain what she had done to that ground. She had been waiting for that question for 6 years. None of that had happened yet on the bright March morning in 1988, when Vera Holst signed the papers on 14 acres of rock and drove out to stand on it for the first time as its owner, looking at ground that cracked under her boots and threw heat back at her face even in early spring, and decided she was going to do something with it that no one in the valley was going to understand for a very long time. To understand how 14 acres of limestone shelf that no one would buy for any price became the only water-bearing land in the Sorrow Creek Valley during the worst drought in 60 years, you have to start with the man who had controlled water in that valley for 2 decades, and with the particular confidence of a person who has been right about everything for long enough that he has forgotten what it feels like to be surprised. Sorrow Creek Valley had never been a place that encouraged a woman with a geology book and a theory to set up on rocky land and start moving stones around. And the story of what Vera Holst built there, slowly and without anyone's permission or understanding, became the kind of thing people in the valley told in 2 very different versions depending on who they were and what they had lost in the summer of 1995. Sorrow Creek Valley ran 12 miles north to south through its county. Good irrigated farmland along the creek bottom and increasingly rocky, thin-soiled ground toward the eastern limestone shelf. And water in the valley had always been the variable that determined which operations thrived and which ones stayed marginal. Denton Rue had come to the valley in the mid-1960s with capital his family had earned elsewhere and spent it on a combination of the best creek-bottom farmland available and, more importantly, a controlling interest in the valley's water cooperative, the Sorrow Creek Valley Water Authority, which managed the irrigation allotments, permitted new well drilling, and administered the groundwater monitoring program that was supposed to track the valley's aquifer levels on a quarterly basis. By the time Denton had chaired the Water Authority for 15 years, those quarterly reports had become a formality that the board reviewed and filed without much scrutiny. Partly because the aquifer had always recovered between dry years in the past, and partly because scrutinizing the monitoring data too carefully would have raised uncomfortable questions about the rate at which Rue's own expanded irrigation draws were affecting the valley's total groundwater budget. People in Sorrow Creek Valley had a way of talking about Denton Rue that sounded like respect for his water management expertise until you examined it closely enough to realize that almost nobody in the valley had ever successfully challenged a water authority decision that affected his own operations' interests, and hadn't for longer than most of them could remember. Vera Holst had moved to the valley from 2 states away, following a geology degree she'd completed at 32 after a decade of working field jobs that had taken her across more arid landscapes than most academic geologists ever walked. And she had come to the Sorrow Creek Valley specifically because a set of old topographic surveys she'd found in a university library archive suggested to her that the valley's eastern limestone shelf sat above a perched aquifer system that the valley's existing water management framework had never acknowledged, never mapped, and never drawn from. A perched aquifer is a body of groundwater that sits above the main water table, trapped by an impermeable layer below it and recharged by surface infiltration above, and it is almost always invisible to conventional well drilling because the drillers are looking for the main aquifer deeper down and drill past the perch system without ever sampling it. The 14 acres of rocky, cracked hardpan that Denton Rue's agent had sold her for less than the price of a used truck were sitting directly on top of the infiltration recharge zone for that perch system, which was why the land cracked and drained the way it did and why nobody had ever managed to farm it conventionally, and which was also, if she was right about what the old surveys were telling her, the reason it was the most strategically valuable piece of ground in the entire valley in a prolonged drought scenario. She did not tell Denton Rue or anyone connected to the Water Authority any of this, because she was not certain enough yet to want to be wrong in public, and because she understood, from watching the valley for 6 months before she bought anything, that the person who announced an unconventional theory about water in Denton Rue's valley before they had the evidence to prove it was going to spend a lot of time defending the theory instead of building the evidence. Denton Rue handled the land sale himself. Through the small real estate arm his office ran as a sideline, and he was present when Vera signed the papers, which gave him the opportunity to deliver his opinion of the purchase in person rather than through the more indirect channel of the feed store counter, where he usually circulated his assessments of other people's decisions. That ground has been on the books for 18 years, he told her, leaning back in his chair with the ease of a man who has delivered this kind of news before. 2 different owners before you try to do something with it, and couldn't get anything to grow. The rock goes down 12 feet in places before you hit anything worth calling soil. I won't pretend I'm not glad to have it off the books. And I'll tell you honestly, I don't know what you think you're going to do with it. Vera told him she appreciated his candor and asked whether the deed included mineral rights, a question that produced a brief, interesting pause before he confirmed that it did. Since the previous owners had retained nothing and the rights had come along with the land through both prior transfers at no additional value because everyone involved had assumed there was nothing under it worth specifying. She signed without negotiating the price down, which Denton mentioned to his office manager afterward as the clearest sign that he was dealing with someone who didn't know what she was doing, a woman who didn't even try to leverage what should have been obvious weakness in her own position. He was still saying that 6 months later when the first truckload of stones arrived and Vera started moving them. Her closest neighbor in the valley was a woman named June Pratt, who farmed 12 acres of marginal ground between Vera's limestone shelf and the better irrigated creek bottom land below, and June was the first person to ask Vera directly what she was doing with the rocks. Doing so over the fence one afternoon in the first summer with the particular directness of a neighbor who has decided that watching in silence is less satisfying than just asking. Rock mulching, Vera told her, which was technically accurate and explained almost nothing. Keeps the soil temperature down, reduces evaporation, channels what little rain there is directly into the ground rather than letting it run off the surface. June looked at the arrangements Vera had been building, patterns of stone that ran in gentle curves across the slope of the land, and said that she had never heard of anyone rock mulching a whole field before. Usually people take rocks out of their fields, she said. Vera agreed that was usually the approach. June drove home that evening genuinely uncertain what she had just watched, and mentioned it to her husband at dinner, who said it sounded like something a person did when they didn't have anything better to do with their time and the land they'd bought wasn't any good for normal farming. A diagnosis that matched what the rest of the valley was thinking well enough that nobody pushed further on it for quite some time. Denton Rue's first formal complaint to the Water Authority arrived the following spring, citing Vera's earthworks, specifically the shallow channels she had begun cutting between the rock arrangements, as a potential surface water diversion that might affect drainage patterns on adjacent properties. Language that was technically within the authority's jurisdiction and was true enough in a narrow sense that the complaint couldn't be immediately dismissed, but false enough in its implied scale. That Vera, reading it, recognized it as something between a fishing expedition and a warning shot from a man who had noticed something happening on that land that he didn't yet understand but already disliked on principle. Dr. Yusuf Osei had been running the Arid Lands Hydrology Program at the State Geological Survey for 11 years when Vera wrote to him in the fall of 1990, enclosing her own soil permeability measurements from the limestone shelf along with her interpretation of the old topographic surveys and a description of the infiltration system she had been building for 2 years. He read the letter twice and then looked at the survey maps she'd included for a long time before he replied, because the argument she was making, that the eastern shelf of Sorrow Creek Valley sat above an unmapped perched aquifer that had never been documented because nobody had ever looked for it, was either a significant geological oversight or a significant misreading of the data, and from the quality of her field measurements, he could not tell which from a distance. He drove out that November, spent 2 days on the property, and came back to his office in the city with soil samples, a hand-drawn infiltration map, and a conviction that Vera Holst had found something real. "The perched system is there," he told her on the phone the following week, in the clipped manner of a man who had been wrong about enough things in his career to be careful about how certain he sounded. "Your infiltration work is creating a genuine recharge pathway. Whether there's enough volume in the system to matter in a serious drought, I can't tell you yet, because nobody has ever drilled into it to measure it. But the geology is consistent with your interpretation, and the permeability readings from your rock mulching sections are significantly better than what you'd expect from unmodified limestone shelf of this type." He mentioned that he'd like to run a formal survey if she could get access permission for the adjacent parcels, which she told him she couldn't, and that he'd be glad to file a formal note with the State Geological Survey documenting the potential perch system, which she told him she would appreciate but asked him to do quietly without sending copies to the County Water Authority, a request he agreed to without asking why, since the politics of local water management were familiar enough territory that the reason was fairly obvious. Vera did not change anything visible about her operation after Osei's visit, and she did not share his assessment with anyone in the valley, continuing instead the slow, patient work of extending her rock arrangement and channel system across the full 14 acres at the methodical pace she'd been maintaining since the beginning. She had secured a small research partnership with Osei's program that provided her with quarterly soil moisture readings from sensors he'd helped her install across the property, data she kept in a folder on her kitchen table alongside his preliminary geological notes and her own field records going back to the first year. The Water Authority sent 2 more formal complaints over the following 3 years, each one slightly more specifically worded than the last, citing first the channel system and then a small collection basin she'd built at the lowest point of the property as unauthorized water infrastructure, each one meeting a written response from Vera that cited the basin's capacity in cubic feet, its complete reliance on precipitation falling on her own property, and the relevant section of the county's surface water code that exempted on-property precipitation collection of under a specific volume from authority permit requirements, a threshold her basin was sized to stay beneath. She had looked up that threshold before she dug the first shovelful. Denton reviewed her responses with his attorney after the third one, and the attorney told him that she appeared to have read the code carefully enough that pushing for enforcement would likely produce a legal exchange his client wouldn't necessarily win, advice that frustrated Denton considerably because it suggested a level of preparation he hadn't expected from a woman who had spent 4 years moving rocks around a field. He drove past her property more frequently through 1993, the way he'd driven past Owen Sharp's bog in Eastfield County and Nora Vetch's trenched cornfield in Creswell County, slowly and without stopping, the way a man looks at something he knows is changing without yet being able to articulate what it's changing into. The drought arrived in the spring of 1994 and did not leave. By the end of that year's growing season, the Valley's Creek had dropped to its lowest recorded level. The Water Authority had imposed its first mandatory irrigation restrictions in 22 years, and Denton Rue's own monitoring program had produced aquifer readings that were worse than anything in the Valley's recorded history, but that Denton had not yet shared with the full authority board in the specific terms that would have required an emergency response, presenting them instead in the quarterly report format that made numbers look like information rather than alarms. By the summer of 1995, after a second consecutive year of below-average rainfall and above-average irrigation draws, the Valley's main aquifer had dropped below the pump intake depth of 11 of the Valley's 14 active irrigation wells, effectively ending those operations' ability to draw water at the moment they needed it most. The 3 remaining wells, including Denton's own, were pumping from increasingly deep pools against an aquifer that his own monitoring data now showed would not recover within the current seasonal cycle. June Pratt's well went dry on a Tuesday morning in July, and she called Vera that afternoon not because she expected an answer, but because she'd run out of people to call, and Vera was the closest neighbor whose line she hadn't already used. Vera told her to come over, which June did, and what she found when she drove the half-mile to the limestone shelf was a piece of ground that should, by every logic she understood about the valley they both lived in, have been as dry as everything else around it. The ground cover Vera had planted between the rock arrangements was green. Not stressed green, not surviving green. Actually, visibly, growing green, the way plants look when they have more water than they need rather than less. June stood at the fence looking at it for a long time before she said anything. "Vera," she said finally, "what did you do?" The Water Authority emergency session convened 3 weeks later, called not by Denton, but by 3 board members who had collectively decided that the aquifer situation could no longer be managed through quarterly report language and needed a formal public accounting. The room held more people than it had seen at any meeting in the authority's history. Farmers whose wells had gone dry and whose operations were in various stages of emergency. Some of them having already begun negotiations with Denton's operation about emergency water purchase at prices that, several of them had noted, were considerably higher than any prior drought pricing the authority had ever approved. Denton presented the aquifer data himself, in the format he'd been using for 3 years, and was midway through the explanation of why the situation, while serious, remained manageable within existing authority frameworks when Yusuf Osei stood up from the third row and asked permission to speak. Holding a state geological survey document that the board chair recognized as an official state filing and therefore could not procedurally decline to acknowledge. Osei had driven 4 hours that morning, at Vera's request and on 2 days' notice, bringing with him 8 years of soil moisture sensor data from the Hulse property, his 1990 preliminary geological assessment documenting the perched aquifer system, and a formal state survey update he had filed that week specifically naming the recharge zone on the eastern limestone shelf as an active, currently functioning groundwater system, separate from the main valley aquifer, currently holding a documented water volume sufficient to support limited but meaningful domestic and agricultural use. He also brought a copy of the Water Authority's own groundwater monitoring protocol, which required quarterly testing of all known aquifer systems within the valley boundary, and which had not, in 22 years of Denton Rue's chairmanship, included any testing of the Eastern Shelf's perch system, because the protocol had been written before anyone knew the system existed and had never been updated to include it. Denton's own monitoring program, in other words, had a documented gap that corresponded precisely to the water source that was, at that moment, the only functioning one in the valley, and the gap had existed under his chairmanship for the entire period during which the main aquifer had been declining without corresponding recharge. Vera laid her 8 years of field records on the table beside Osei's survey, said nothing beyond identifying the documents, and sat back down. The authority board voted that evening to commission a formal independent audit of the valley's complete groundwater system, including the perched aquifer on the eastern shelf, a motion that passed without Denton's opposition because opposing it would have required him to explain, in front of 67 people whose wells were dry, why he was against finding more water. The audit results, delivered 6 weeks later, confirmed everything Osei's assessment had suggested. The perch system held enough volume to supply emergency domestic water to the valley's affected households through the remainder of the drought cycle, was actively recharging through the infiltration system Vera had built over 6 years, and had been entirely absent from the authority's monitoring framework throughout the period of the main aquifer's decline. The report's language about the monitoring gap was careful and technically neutral, but the arithmetic it implied was available to anyone who read the report and the authority's own filing history in the same sitting, and a significant number of people in Sorrow Creek Valley did exactly that in the weeks after it was released. Denton Rue retained his seat on the Water Authority through the end of his term, because the board's procedures did not include a mechanism for removing a member over a monitoring protocol gap, and his farming operation retained access to water through an emergency purchase arrangement with Vera that she negotiated at a fair price without punishing him for 6 years of nuisance complaints. Because punishing him was not the point and never had been. What changed was simpler and in some ways more permanent. The authority's monitoring protocol was rewritten to include all known subsurface water systems within the valley boundary, The Eastern Shelf's recharge zone was designated a protected water resource under the State Geological Survey's recommendation, and no water authority complaint about Vera Holst's land use was filed or seriously considered again, because the record of what that land use had produced was now part of the valley's official groundwater documentation in a way that made the earlier complaints read, in retrospect, like a detailed account of a man trying to stop something he didn't understand from working. The lesson Sorrow Creek Valley eventually arrived at from the whole affair, the version that settled into the valley's collective memory over the following years, was not a comfortable one for a community that had trusted one man's management of a shared resource for 2 decades without asking many hard questions about what that management actually looked like beneath the surface of the quarterly reports. Denton Rue had not set out to mismanage anything. He had simply never asked whether the framework he'd inherited and run for 20 years was measuring everything that needed to be measured, and the cost of that unasked question had been paid by every farmer in the valley whose well went dry in the summer of 1995, while 14 acres of limestone shelf nobody wanted held water that nobody knew was there. Vera Holst had spent 6 years asking a question nobody else in the valley thought was worth asking, doing the work that the question required without announcing it, and building the evidence that answered it one rock arrangement and one soil moisture reading at a time. And by the time the drought made the question unavoidable, the answer was already 8 years old and sitting in a folder on her kitchen table. Drive out to the eastern shelf of Sorrow Creek Valley today, and the 14 acres that a county assessor called unbuildable and agriculturally worthless for 20 years is recognizable as the same rocky ground it has always been. The limestone still cracking through the surface in the same gray shelves, the grade still dropping away from the road in the same way it always has. What is different is the pattern of the stones, which follows a logic that most people driving past cannot quite identify, but cannot quite dismiss as random either, and the ground cover between them, which runs greener and denser than anything growing on the valley floor in dry years, and the small hand-lettered sign at the gate that gives nothing away beyond a name and a date. The date is 1988, the year she bought the ground and started asking the question that took 6 years of physical labor to answer and 1 drought to prove. If this story landed for you, hit like before you go, because it genuinely helps more people find it. Share it with someone who has ever been told that the ground they were standing on wasn't worth anything, and who kept standing on it anyway. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, because there is a new one every week. And down in the comments, tell us about a time you found something valuable exactly where everyone else had already looked and walked away. We read every single one.